my name's Jose, and I live in California in Sacramento, the state capital. Um, I'm a nonfiction writer, but I kind of come from a performing arts poetry background and have also worked in, private industries like for Adobe, like working with artists to get people to do cool things. So I've kind of similar to, I'm sure a lot of your paths and trajectories, very non-traditional, interdisciplinary, and kind of like trying to weave different things that I like together and call it like a career or like an interest or a profession. But just trying to, you know, tell stories really in cool and dynamic ways. And, you know, um, I hope today that I can share parts of my strategy and story behind two big projects that I've done recently. These two books I've written called Interstate and Chipped. One's very much about California, and one's about skateboarding. Two related things, but very potentially, different approaches in terms of how those projects came to be and how those narratives kind of came to light. But yeah, what is the biggest hurdle? This was my response. I want to write in my own voice with my own style, but still keep an audience of strangers alongside me. And I want readers to work while building honest invitations in the writing. And we'll get to that, like what that means a little bit more down the line, in terms of honest invitations. Um, but that's kind of like that's like my like fork in the road. That's like my struggle is like, how do I write? How do I talk to readers or an audience or however you want to define it, like we are right now, like we're talking over a coffee or a beer, like how can I keep it that casual, but also and natural, and but how do I and keep total strangers alongside of me. This is kind of some high level bullet points of just like how I would start to kind of define the way I approach narrative, and some of the things I want to talk about today as, for me, like writing as an active act of archiving or like new histories. Um, how is it that a creative nonfiction piece or even say a short film or a short documentary or an article, how can these things create like new rings of a tree, so to speak, like new histories and new archiving, what's being preserved, and which kind of leads to this next bullet point of the role and limits of a writer's voice in filling historical gaps. I'm sure in our research or in your research, you've encountered roadblocks or, blind spots, hurdles, missing information, things that you just don't know, places you can't go to, people you can't talk to. How do we fill those gaps in the narrative? And how do we kind of embrace the unknown? Which leads to that third bullet point of utilizing research to fill historical gaps. And research can also mean like personal experiences, you going on a journey or some type of sojourn to understand a place better. And we'll get into that. But utilizing research to fill the historical gaps and find moments to enter the conversation as a writer, find your place. And this I think goes to voice. And some of the things that Hanton was mentioning earlier of just like how do I blend my more creative nonfiction voice into, you know, an academic journal piece, or how can I, use imagery to better reflect my voice in, in ways that really reflect the tone of the story. Like how can we use voice in these moments? And to say these points even more simply, what do we have? What don't we know? And then where do we want to go and what are we trying to map? These are some questions I've been asking myself a lot when writing nonfiction. And I kind of or at least these are questions I keep coming back to. This is like my fork in the road, to the group question. This is kind of what I encounter all the time. It's like, what do I have? What don't I, what don't I know? What are my blind spots, and what am I trying to do with it? That third bullet point could be like the why, you know, um, it could be that, amidst that quantum research, that we mentioned, like, um, what sliver do I want to hold up to the world and say like, this is it, this is what matters, like this is the thing. Um, so to get into that, this is a book I wrote called Interstate Essays from California. Um, and it came out 2 years ago. And the first essay in the book is called Interstate, and it's about my grandfather. He was a migrant farm worker who immigrated from Mexico to Oklahoma and then moved west in the 40s, picking crops and doing odd jobs. When he got to California, he was a migrant farm worker all across the state. um, Being a migrant farm worker, you're not really trying to leave a paper trail behind. You're kind of a ghost in a sense, or at least the way he operated. He was kind of very much under the radar. So I mentioned these things to talk about like what I don't know, what I was trying to kind of talk about in this book. But to get to that big, massive essay that starts this book, I had to start really small and local. And at the time, I just moved to Sacramento, like I was mentioning earlier. But for about 20 years, I was living in the Bay Area, in Oakland, and working in San Francisco. So more metropolitan, more kind of the West Coast New York, so to speak, all that. And the Bay Area was going through a lot of rapid changes, and there was a big population influx around 2015. Public transportation was kind of bursting at the gills. You couldn't find a seat on the train. You just kind of packed all day. Um, and there was a lot of questions around gentrification, around homelessness, and all within a 7 by 7 mile city. So I started documenting these different changes that were happening to the downtown skyline on my way to work or on my way after work in downtown San Francisco, and just kind of creating this tactile archiving, this relationship with photography enables. This is done with like a disposable 35 millimeter camera of a massive high rise in downtown San Francisco. And I really didn't have like an agenda. I didn't know what story I was trying to tell, but I knew I just wanted to document these changes and to document the city that I was experiencing at that present time. And this is a good example of how a lot of people were feeling in the Bay Area at the time, which was like work, 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 and exhaustion. Like this. It was very much kind of the vibe at the time, so to speak. Um, and so I started, thinking about like the Bay Area and how like this changes were kind of taking place. And I started writing these kind of one-off essays about, going to bars that I liked, waking up in the city and taking these photos, and kind of turned nonfiction into this meta exercise. Like I'm going to document myself by talking about the activities I do in this city at this time in history, and to show the significance of these kind of things at this point in time. Whether it's going to a bar and, taking over the jukebox all night, or, showing up early and documenting murals that are painted on Monday and gone by Friday, or businesses that are open for a month and gone the next month, whatever it is, like documenting it and giving myself that agency. So I started thinking about I started writing these articles for this online magazine, and I met my editor, who would become my book editor. And he just kind of all the ideas I was pitching at him, he kind of held them back to me and said, like, all you're doing is writing about California. Why? Like, like, why is it so important to you? And I realized it went back to my grandfather. And I started thinking and remembering I have a lot of ephemera of my grandfather. This is a photo my mom took of us in maybe when I was in college, like mid 2000, like early 2000s. Um, and I started looking at this stuff and kind of seeing the changes similar to San Francisco and similar to the Bay Area. I started realizing the changes in some of the photos and video I had of him. And and then I realized that some of these things might go away. So I started scanning the photos and building this kind of archive of stuff, this kind of dashboard of material just to have it, right? So I digitized this high 8 video camcorder footage I had of my grandfather. This is a screenshot of it. And, you know, everything in this photo is gone. Like my grandfather is no longer on this earth. This backyard is no longer the way it is. Like it's owned by someone else now. Like, but it was this history that I was able to document in the mid 2000s, not knowing, only doing it because I knew I wanted to document it, you know? Years later, over 10 years later, I'm now digitizing it and just kind of wrestling with it, you know? Like what does it mean, you know, to have this footage now? And so I briefly wanted to read the opening of Interstate, the book and the essay. This is the very first page. And I want to read this to exemplify what do we do with archival material that we either produce or research and find. How do we take it from our dashboard, our you know, the drawing board, our working table, our journal, and how do we kind of turn it into something narrative? And so for me, it was kind of embracing the meta nature of it and trying to paint the scene. So the very beginning of Interstate begins like this. In the digitized high-8 footage, my abuelo's home remains. The massive fruit tree and retaining wall dividing the backyard from the shared neighborhood rear alley. An old California farm town with many ditches in the middle of the alley, dead ending at the wash, carrying water down from the San Gabriel Valley mountains of San Dimas Canyon, Mount Baldy, Mount San Antonio, and beyond. Down and through the suburbs and river of the same namesake, somewhere near Almonte's collision with the Irwindale mineral mines and drag races, that infamous 10 to 605 freeway interchange. Clipped to his white shirt is the lavalier mic I'd purchased at the Radio Shack in a shopping center up the street that used to house a remodeled Kmart and no longer houses kids skating its loading docks before stealing rolls of film. The lavalier is plugged into the wrong part of the high-8 camera, which had been boxed and unused for years on my dad's dresser. Thankfully, the camera's built-in microphone catches Abuelo's words clearly after a brief test shot of him curiously introducing himself to the camera. Antonio Gomez, the expression on his face like he was hearing his name aloud for the first time. My abuelo exists between my first and last names, Jose, which I share with my father, and Vadi, the last name of our Afro-Boricua ancestors who took the name of their Corsican sugar plantation landowner Vadi, erasing their indigenous name Valle, according to my dad, Jose Miguel, whose first name I bear before Antonio, my mother's father. Jose Antonio Gomez Vadi, two patriarchs resting like gargoyles on either side of my tongue, multiple namesakes for a worldview inherited to honor and evolve. So like in that thing, I'm using a screenshot of me interviewing my grandfather to talk about, you know, setting the names of both of my family's side, my name, introducing myself. There's all this stuff kind of going on. And so we're not shying away from like the chaos of having too much information. We're weaving it and embracing it and trying to find ways to coherently deliver it and introduce folks in ways that feels natural or feels kind of conversational, ideally. And so as this essay progresses, you see me traveling through the state of California, following where my grandfather may have worked and where I knew he worked through that interview, him telling me information. So to get there, I started literally mapping, redrawing the state of California in a way that made sense to me. So this is all my handwriting and me redrawing Interstate 5, Highway 99, the highways that connect the two through the Central Valley. This is all big farmland. And I started plotting out historical locations related to his experience, but also other things just like of my own interest. Like in this town of Caruthers, there's the world's biggest box of raisins, like this artificial box of raisins that's like massive. And it will, you know, I started doing these road trips and just kind of experiencing the Central Valley. This is the high-speed rail that's currently under construction in the Central Valley. This is a random, there's this website called like weirdfacts.california, and I found like this weird plane crashing into a gas station I took a photo of. But I also started finding historical monuments related parallel to my grandfather's experience. This is a mass grave of 28 bracero workers, farm workers, who were killed in a plane crash, and they were buried in an unmarked grave, which you see here below. Activists and pastors in the community created a new grave, which you see above, that has all the names of all the victims that were killed that day. These citizens were being deported when they were killed. The plane crashed into nearby mountains. This is what it looks like, in kind of situation. So my grandfather's not buried there. My grandfather was not on that plane. However, he was traveling through California circa 1948. He was a farm worker during this time. So triangulating or connecting the known histories that I'm literally seeing and witnessing with those that I'm inheriting from my grandfather shaped this narrative, by way of me describing everything I'm telling you right now, like describing why I'm there, what I'm experiencing, and writing hypotheticals of like, what if he was on this plane, and what if this moment right now is me saying hello to him, in the afterlife, I don't know. But to ask those questions by way in the narrative itself and in the prose, I think enabled me to kind of um, keep the narrative going forward, this kind of road trip motif, but also to ground it in very real, poignant moments that connect to this personal thing that I'm trying to describe. This is another monument to braceros that were killed in a car crash in 1963, a little after my grandfather's time working in the fields, but again, close enough to it to create this kind of parallel moment. And as you can see in the background, there are like farm workers who are not bracero workers, but farm workers working still in the fields that are like, memorialized here. So these kind of active histories, right? Like the topography hasn't necessarily changed since 1963. The developments haven't really increased. So you're almost, by way of sitting there and standing there and documenting it, like that experiential, it helps for me shape like some of the narrative approach. And then, also failing, like getting into car wrecks and like bursting my tires and feeling like an idiot was part of the kind of experiential process as well. And again, the fork in the road that all narrative must face, right? This is the personification of it in terms of creative nonfiction, is sometimes your plans don't go right. And that becomes part of the narrative too, is realizing that even in this privileged state of, at the time, being unemployed and driving around and finding these different spots, towns I knew where he worked, towns I thought he may have passed through, that were like popular thoroughfares for other farm workers, things can still go awry. And embracing that and bringing that into the narrative too, I think helped build empathy with readers. So that was like the Interstate project. And it was very much inspired also by social media history, kind of archival accounts. These are two accounts run by Guadalupe Rosales. She grew up in Boyle Heights, a neighborhood in East LA. And she started this account called Veteranas en Rucas, which is basically a dedication to Cholo and Chola culture in the late 80s and early 90s in LA. This kind of overlaps with a lot of rave culture and a lot of dance crews, but also a lot of gangster culture and street gangs and that life as well. It's kind of like in the middle of this Venn diagram. Um, it was a really interesting crowdsourced account where it's a combination of photos that were sent to her, but also photos from her own family. Um, and it just really inspired a lot of Interstate, as well as Map Points. Map Points is like a sister project that's more focused on raves and party culture, backyard parties, ditch parties, kids ditching school and having parties in the middle of the day, that kind of stuff, and the impact it had on Chicano culture in the 90s. So I point that out to kind of showcase the role that, social media can be a pretty toxic space, but, the role in which research can play in our digital age, and just kind of embracing things that we find on our feed that are actually substantive and can help um, see how people respond to different presentations of narrative. Like these are kind of mini micro short stories that are presented to an audience who then provide feedback in real time. And if not, add on to the stories in the comments section. So you're able to really see like how people memorialize their own lives and their own experiences through things like through accounts like these, in my opinion. And so I really want to talk now about space and topography and physical space and our relationship with space. And a lot of Interstate, I realized, was a product of being a skateboarder. This is a set of stairs in San Francisco, but for skaters, we see this. We see history, and we see all this in real time. you know, Certain skateboarders that do certain tricks down historical spots, they put those spots on the map. And then we as skaters are so intrigued by it that we want to actually go stare at it, even if it's knobbed and prohibitive. We actually just want to see it. Like, what does the run up look like? How busy is the street that he's rolling into? How high is the ledge? What type of concrete is that brick? Is that a stucco brick, or how waxed is it? All these things kind of come to mind as a skateboarder, as a street skateboarder. And as I was riding interstate, I started realizing more and more how skateboarding was impacting my POV for everything. So, similar to those initial slides about San Francisco and how the city was changing, I started doing the same around skateboarding and skate spots. Similar to finding my grandfather's fields, I just started applying that to everything. Like, let's go find the original building of everything. Like, if this band played in San Francisco at a venue that's now a 7-Eleven, like let's go find that 7-Eleven, like just really embracing the narrative as a road trip or as a journey. So again, like just finding spots and just seeing the befores and after and trying to document it as much as possible. And these are all spots in San Francisco that if you showed the skater just the physical location, they would see what you see on the right. They would see the image associated with it in their mind, right? This is another one in San Francisco. So again, this relationship with space and history, we see older cars in the right here. We see changes to the street and the poles, how we archive. And so I started submitting some of these things to really geeky social media accounts. Again, like very much inspired by the rave and Chicano stuff I was showing earlier. I started finding other accounts that were as nerdy and as concerned. So I started like, oh, this spot in San Francisco, I know that spot. It's now covered by the ivy, and you can kind of see the development over time. Um, it's nerdy. It's kind of arbitrary, esoteric, but it's understanding of before and after, and understanding the relationship with space that skateboards continue to have with these landmarks. And so that very much led to this book, Chipped. It comes out in April, and it's all about skateboarding. This is my friend's elbows all red from skating all day, and that's his board, and falling. But I started really thinking about this idea of space, and I wanted to talk about one essay in there called "King Shit" or "Can a King Be a King?" And this is me triangulating a lot of different stuff. And I think you guys might relate because, seeing the forest from the trees, like this is me building a really massive forest and like really trying to just build it. And during the pandemic, I really was inspired by the music of Sun Ra. And I started skating this spot here, this parking lot, and learning a type of trick that requires you to bash into curbs. And basically, instead of popping into tricks, you're bashing into them. And it's a 180 of your understanding of skateboarding. So I'm listening to free jazz, like very abstract free jazz music that Sun Ra produces. I'm skating these curbs in a weird way. And I'm watching skate videos that use Sun Ra's music as background. And I'm doing just more and more research about this musician and why he was so impactful. So this is Jackie McLean. He is a jazz musician, composer, saxophonist. This is him teaching a class in the 70s about Sun Ra.
Well, I've been saying that word to you for all these years. Have you listened to one Sun Ra record? You have. Do you like his music? It's kind of far out. I'm here. But do you think it's worthwhile listening to? Because I told you to, and I know about what I'm talking about. I saw Sun Ra last Saturday night in New York, and he played. His band played for a long time, and they played really good music and everything. But why does he have to walk out with capes on and potentially Sabbath? The same reason that they belong to Blue Smoke up. And only thing about Sun Ra is he's been wearing those blue capes and playing electronic music since 1957. That's what I've been trying to tell all of you, man. He's the master of it and the personifier of all that crap music that he was playing. But when he walk out, like, they have a big setup and he had a lot of musicians and they're playing good rhythms and he come walk down, like walk up and down in front of everybody, like smiling like he's a king or something like that. Man, can't he be a god and a king? The man's 60, been out here starving all these years. Can he be a god and a king? Can he be, man? Let him be. What you talking about? You losing? I'm losing you. Look, I'm talking about he's smiling because he's not smiling because he's getting $50,000 a week to be a hamburger. He's smiling because the music he writes is being played and artistically he's being fulfilled and he puts on a cape and plays his electronic piano and walks up and smiles and lives with his musicians and they have a commune. He's a teacher and a great, great artist, man. And he is not accepted commercially. So he ain't smiling because somebody from our CBS or CTI is out there getting ready to give him a big contract and a worldwide tour. He's smiling because he's a king and he's in heaven. Can't somebody smile? Like, for instance,
in the video, I know the audio might have been jumbled, but Jackie McLean is talking with a student about like, did you go to New York and see the Sun Ra show? And the student is saying like, why does Sun Ra have to dress in these garbs and have this like smile and like kind of performative, you know? And Jackie McLean is saying like, this he can do whatever he wants. Like, can a king be a king? Like he's been starving for years. He's been doing electronic music before all your favorite musicians have been doing it. It's this very kind of combative debate, between professor and student that really inspired, this essay I wrote. But I share that to kind of take a peek into my drawing board. It's like a tweet, a skate video, a jazz musician walk into a parking lot. It's almost like a joke, right? It's almost like two guys and a girl walk into a bar. It's like that kind of joke, how do I take all this ephemera, like this social media video, a skate video that uses a Sun Ra song, the jazz musician Sun Ra themselves, and me skateboarding this parking lot during the pandemic? How do we weave this together and make something about it? And so I'll just read the very first page of that essay, where my solution to that was basically realizing this fact, which is Sun Ra is my favorite skater of all time, and I've never seen him skate, nor do I have any evidence that one of the most underrecognized and greatest jazz musicians, performers, and composers of all time was indeed a skateboarder. But his heel flips, I imagine, are flicked, lofted, caught, and landed with such immeasurable style that he can only be number one in my heart. So I turned Sun Ra into a skater. I don't know that he's ever skated. I don't have any confirmation. I don't think he ever skated. Even the types of boards that he would need to do a heel flip may not have existed in the time that he was alive. But the motif enables me to kind of kick off an essay and bring skaters and musicians alike into this kind of conversation about, music, race, arts, the ability to survive, representation, and reference, these things. Jackie McLean's documentaries about Sun Ra, the use of Sun Ra in skateboarding. But I kind of create a lie to tell a truth, and that's kind of a fun device of nonfiction writing, of the hypothetical. In Interstate, I have hypotheticals of my grandfather smoking in the middle of the night, things that I know may probably didn't happen, but I'm allowing myself to imagine that they could or that they did, to talk about other larger, truths in nonfiction. So just wanted to share that, and that's kind of my last, I think, thing here. This is some screenshots from A Joyful Noise, another documentary that very much inspired the essay. But again, we're embracing different multimedias, interdisciplinary, things. We're kind of embracing everything that we have, the forest, but we're also trying to find that angle that, the lead or that opening argument that allows us, to see just a tree before we see the entire forest. Um, so again, these are some of the questions, to kind of maybe to shape our conversation with your guys' stuff. And the workshop is, what do we have? What don't we know? Where do we want to go? And or what are we trying to map? These are just to kind of recircle back to these points. That's some questions I always ground my approach and may help with yours moving forward. But I'll stop sharing my screen and I'll stop talking.